You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The notification came through at 11:47 PM on a Thursday, cutting through the silence of my studio apartment like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Amazon was hiring immediately for overnight warehouse positions at DFW7, their newest facility outside Dallas. The pay was significantly better than anything I'd seen in months of searching, and the overnight shift would perfectly accommodate my day classes at community college. I'd always thrived on structure, on clear expectations and well-defined procedures, so warehouse work seemed like it might actually be the stability I'd been desperately seeking. Tyler, 26, perpetual student, turned reluctant adult, sitting in boxers and a faded college t-shirt, laptop balanced precariously on my knees, in an apartment that cost more than I could really afford. That was me, staring at a job posting that felt like salvation wrapped in corporate efficiency. The drive out to DFW7 the next evening took me through increasingly empty Texas landscape, my beat-up Honda struggling against the persistent wind that seemed to blow constantly across these flat plains. The facility rose from the horizon like a monument to modern commerce. 1.2 million square feet of corrugated steel and concrete, gleaming under banks of sodium lights that turned the night an industrial orange. The parking lot stretched for what seemed like miles, mostly empty except for a few dozen cars clustered near the employee entrance like a small herd seeking warmth and safety. Linda met me at the security checkpoint. She appeared to be in her early 50s with steel grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct, unwavering stare that suggested she'd seen everything the night shift could possibly produce and remained unimpressed by all of it. Her Amazon vest was perfectly pressed, name tag aligned with mathematical precision, everything about her appearance regulation, down to her steel-toed boots and the way she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned every promotion through sheer, uncompromising competence. Tyler, I'm Linda, night shift supervisor. Welcome to DFW7. I hope you're ready to work hard and follow directions precisely. The orientation process was the standard corporate procedure. Safety videos that felt like they'd been filmed sometime in the mid-1990s. Proper lifting techniques, demonstrated by actors who'd clearly never worked a day of physical labour in their lives, detailed instructions on how to use the handheld scanner without damaging either the device or yourself. The facility during evening hours was impressive, but unremarkable in its industrial efficiency. Endless rows of shelving stretched into the distance like a geometric forest of consumer desires, filled with the accumulated wants and needs of American consumers. Conveyor belts snaked through the space like mechanical rivers, carrying packages towards their final destinations with relentless, hypnotic efficiency. You'll be working Section K, Linda explained as we walked deeper into the warehouse, our footsteps echoing in the vast space with an almost cathedral-like resonance. It's our most remote section, physically separated from the main floor, but also our quietest. It's an ideal place to learn the ropes without the chaos and pressure of the high-traffic areas. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably as we walked deeper into the facility, moving away from the main floor toward areas that felt older, more isolated. Section K existed in a different part of the building entirely, accessible only through a series of corridors that felt like they belonged to a different structure altogether. The air was thicker here, somehow more substantial, and sounds carried strangely, sometimes echoing when they shouldn't, sometimes muffled when they should carry clearly across the concrete floors. I met the rest of the skeleton crew during the shift change, a group of workers who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd found their rhythm in the strange hours between midnight and dawn. David had been picking for 3 years and navigated the aisles with the fluid grace of long practice, every movement economical and purposeful, like a dancer who'd memorized an incredibly complex routine. Rosa handled maintenance, a compact woman in oil-stained coveralls who seemed to understand every mechanical system in the building on an almost intuitive level, able to diagnose problems by listening to sounds that others couldn't even hear. Trevor worked security, a former police officer who traded his badge and the unpredictable stress of street patrol for the more predictable rhythms of corporate surveillance and the quiet satisfaction of walking empty corridors. Section K's got its own personality, David mentioned as we grabbed coffee from the break room, his voice carrying a note I couldn't quite identify, but that made something cold settle in my stomach. Linda will go over the specifics, but just follow the procedures exactly as they're written. No improvising, no shortcuts, no creative problem solving. The rules exist for very specific reasons, and those reasons are more important than they might initially appear. Something in his tone, in the way he chose his words so carefully, made me pay closer attention. But I nodded anyway. I'd always been good at following instructions, even when I didn't fully understand their purpose. At exactly 10 p.m, Linda pulled me aside for what she called a specialized briefing. The warehouse had undergone a complete transformation as the overhead lights dimmed to their overnight setting, shadows pooling between the towering shelves like dark water collecting in the low places. The constant bustle and energy of the day shift had given way to an almost cathedral quiet, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the occasional echo of footsteps on concrete. Tyler, Section K operates under some additional protocols that aren't covered in the standard employee handbook, she said, her voice noticeably lower than it had been during the general orientation. These aren't suggestions or guidelines. They're mandatory requirements that must be followed without exception or deviation. She handed me a laminated card, worn smooth at the edges from countless hands over what must have been many months, or even years. 13 rules were printed in block letters, each one numbered and precise. The text slightly faded, but still clearly legible under the break room's fluorescent lights. Never enter Section K alone, I read aloud. Always work in pairs. Every single rule, Linda interrupted, her tone brooking absolutely no argument or discussion. Follow them exactly as written, word for word. No exceptions, no judgment calls, no common sense overrides, no attempts to improve or modify the procedures. These protocols exist for very specific reasons, and deviating from them has immediate and serious consequences. I studied the card more carefully, reading through each rule with growing confusion and concern. Some seemed logical enough. Avoid certain areas during designated time periods. Use only approved emergency exits. Report unusual sounds or activities to supervisors immediately. Others were oddly specific in ways that raised uncomfortable questions about what exactly might happen in Section K during the overnight hours. Rule 8 mentioned a man in a blue Amazon vest asking for directions to an old office. Rule 10 instructed me to ignore the sound of children laughing, no matter how realistic or distressing it might sound. Rule 5 told me not to look directly at security cameras between 3:17 and 3:23 a.m., instead keeping my eyes focused on the floor during that specific 6-minute window. Linda, what children would be in a warehouse at 2 a.m? And why those specific times for the cameras? What happens if I look at them during those minutes? Her expression remained perfectly neutral, professionally blank in a way that seemed practiced and deliberate. The kind of children you ignore when you hear them, regardless of how real they sound or how much they might seem to need help. The kind of times when looking at cameras becomes inadvisable for reasons that are beyond the scope of your job responsibilities. Are we completely clear on expectations? Something about her tone, about the way she held herself, about the careful precision of her words, discouraged any further questions. The weight of her stare, the absolute authority in her voice, everything about her body language suggested that these weren't topics open for discussion or clarification. I nodded, slipping the card into my vest pocket next to my employee ID. Excellent. David will be your partner for the first 2 weeks while you learn the specific rhythms and requirements of Section K. Learn from him, follow his lead, trust his judgment. Most importantly, follow the rules without question or hesitation. My first week passed in an intensive blur of learning routes, memorizing product locations, and beginning to understand the complex, almost choreographed dance of warehouse logistics. Section K felt fundamentally different from the rest of the facility in ways I couldn't quite articulate or explain to anyone who asked. The air seemed thicker here, more substantial, as if it carried weight beyond normal atmospheric pressure. Sounds carried strangely, sometimes echoing when they shouldn't, sometimes muffled when they should carry clearly across the open spaces. The temperature never felt quite right, always a degree or two off from comfortable, either too warm or too cold, regardless of the thermostat settings. David worked alongside me with quiet, understated competence, a steady and reassuring presence who seemed to know exactly where to be and when to be there. He had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems before they occurred, redirecting our path around certain aisles at specific times, always checking his watch before entering particular areas, occasionally stopping mid-sentence to listen to sounds I couldn't hear. On Tuesday night of my first week, I met the man in the blue vest. David and I were restocking shelves in aisle 52, working methodically through a large shipment of household electronics that had arrived on the evening truck, when footsteps began echoing from the main corridor. The sound was wrong somehow, too regular, too precise, like a metronome keeping perfect time rather than the natural rhythm of human walking. A figure approached slowly from the shadows between the towering shelving units, emerging into the pool of light where we were working. He was tall and unnaturally thin, wearing what appeared to be the standard Amazon uniform, but something was fundamentally off about the way he moved through space. Too smooth, too fluid, like he was gliding rather than walking, like his feet weren't quite making contact with the concrete floor. His vest was the wrong shade of blue, darker than regulation, almost navy, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a visual dead zone that was difficult to focus on directly. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying an odd, resonant quality that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the words were being spoken directly into my ears, rather than travelling through the air. "Could you direct me to the old office?" Rule 8 flashed in my memory like a neon warning sign, bright and urgent and impossible to ignore. I kept my eyes focused on the package in my hands, deliberately avoiding direct eye contact with the figure. "It's upstairs," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the cold fear crawling up my spine. "Take the main elevator to the second floor." "Thank you very much," he replied, and when I risked the briefest glance upward, the corridor was completely empty. No footsteps receding into the distance, no sound of movement, no indication that anyone had ever been there at all. Just the normal warehouse quiet and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. David hadn't said a single word during the entire exchange, but I caught him watching me afterward with what might have been approval or relief, or perhaps just the satisfaction of seeing a new employee follow instructions correctly. "Good instincts," he said simply. We returned to our work as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it in the air around us, a tension that hadn't been there before, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the atmospheric pressure drops suddenly and your ears pop from the change. Wednesday brought my first encounter with the aisle 47 conveyor belt situation. David and I were working on organising a shipment of computer accessories, sorting items by destination codes when the mechanical rumble started up somewhere in the distance. The sound was distinctive and unmistakable, the heavy rubber belt moving over steel rollers at full speed, but running completely empty, no packages to carry, no purpose for its operation. "Should we investigate?" I asked, thinking it might be a malfunction that needed to be reported to maintenance or Rosa. David was already reaching for his radio with sharp, urgent movements. "Linda, Section K needs you immediately. Aisle 47 situation in progress." The response came back within seconds, crisp and professional. "Understood. On my way." Within minutes, Linda appeared with Rosa in tow, both carrying equipment I didn't recognize. Devices that looked like modified tablets, but with additional sensors, displays, and attachments I couldn't identify. They disappeared into aisle 47, and the belt fell silent with startling suddenness. The quiet was abrupt and complete, like someone had thrown a switch to cut power to the entire system. They emerged 20 minutes later, both looking grim but unsurprised, wearing the expressions of people who dealt with an unpleasant but unfortunately familiar problem. Rosa was carrying additional equipment now, devices that hummed with their own internal power. "Resume normal operations," Linda announced, and that was the end of it. No explanation, no discussion, no acknowledgement that anything unusual or concerning had occurred. Thursday night brought the light flickers that David had warned me about. We were organising a shipment of home goods, working efficiently through boxes of kitchen appliances, when the overhead lights flickered 3 times in rapid succession. The flickers weren't random electrical fluctuations. They were deliberate, measured, timed like a signal being transmitted through the building's electrical system. David immediately dropped what he was doing, not even bothering to set down the package he was holding. It simply fell from his hands and hit the concrete floor with a sharp crack. "We're leaving," he said, his voice carrying an urgency I'd never heard from him before. "Right now, don't look back, don't stop to gather anything, just move." We walked quickly towards Section J, not quite running, but moving with clear purpose and barely controlled panic. Behind us, I could swear I heard something moving in the darkness between the shelves, something large and deliberate that didn't walk so much as flow across the concrete floor, following us but maintaining its distance. "How long do we wait?" I asked once we reached the safety of the break room in Section J. "Until the next shift starts at 6 a.m, David replied, checking his watch with nervous precision. "Rule 6 doesn't allow for exceptions or early returns, regardless of workload or scheduling pressure." We sat in the bright, aggressively normal break room for the remaining hours of our shift, drinking coffee that had gone cold and pretending to do paperwork while something that might have been wind but probably wasn't whistled through Section K with sounds that were almost musical. By Friday of my first week, I'd seen enough to understand with crystal clarity that the rules weren't arbitrary corporate nonsense designed to test new employees or create artificial compliance challenges. They were survival instructions carefully written and refined over time, expressed in the language of policy and procedure to make them palatable and officially sanctioned. Something existed in Section K, something that had been there before the warehouse was built and would remain long after the building was eventually torn down and the land was repurposed for something else. The second week brought Bryan, and everything changed. Bryan had transferred from another Amazon facility in Oklahoma, supposedly for personal reasons that he remained vague about whenever anyone asked for details. He was everything I wasn't, confident to the point of arrogance, dismissive of authority and structure, absolutely convinced that he was smarter than everyone around him, and that most rules were merely suggestions designed for lesser minds who couldn't think for themselves. "Corporate psychology experiment," he declared loudly on his first night, crumpling the rule card Linda had given him into a tight ball and tossing it carelessly toward the trash can. In the break room, he missed, and the wadded paper rolled under a table where it remained forgotten. They're testing how gullible new hires are, seeing who's stupid enough to buy into obvious psychological manipulation, disguised as safety protocol. I tried to explain what I'd witnessed over the past week. The man in the blue vest who wasn't quite there, the empty conveyor belt that ran for no reason, the deliberate light flickers that sent experienced workers running for safety. But Bryan just laughed, a sound that carried too far in the warehouse quiet and seemed to echo from directions that didn't correspond to any physical surfaces. Dude, you're completely buying into their psychological manipulation tactics. It's basic corporate hazing dressed up as safety protocol and wrapped in official-sounding language. It's designed to make you compliant and fearful. Watch me prove how absolutely ridiculous this whole charade is. Friday night of Bryan's first week, Linda assigned us to work together in Section K. It was a decision I could tell she regretted almost immediately, but we were short-staffed due to someone calling out sick, and she had limited options for coverage. Bryan spent the first hour of our shift deliberately violating minor protocols with increasing boldness, stepping directly on floor markings that were supposed to be avoided, whistling loudly in areas where the acoustics felt wrong, and sounds seemed to carry further than they should, making increasingly elaborate jokes about the ghost rules and spooky corporate procedures designed to keep workers in line. Nothing happened during his minor violations, which only reinforced his confidence and made him bolder in his deliberate defiance. "See?" he said, balancing dramatically on one of the forbidden floor markings while spreading his arms wide like a tightrope walker. "It's all psychological manipulation. Make people afraid of arbitrary rules, and they'll police themselves without requiring any actual oversight. Classic corporate mind control techniques, adapted for the modern workplace." At 2:30 a.m, nature called with increasing urgency. Rule 11 was explicit and unambiguous. The restroom facilities in Section K were permanently out of order and should never be used under any circumstances, regardless of convenience or necessity. Always use the facilities in Section J, even if it meant a longer walk and time away from assigned tasks. "I'll be right back," I told Bryan, pointing toward the corridor that led to Section J. "Remember Rule 9, nothing above row 12 after 2 a.m. Don't climb any ladders or reach for anything on the upper shelves." Yeah, he waved me off dismissively, already turning his attention to a nearby shelving unit. "Don't worry about your precious superstitions. I'll try not to get eaten by the warehouse monster while you're gone to use the bathroom like a normal human being." The walk to Section J took exactly 5 minutes each way, a journey I'd timed multiple times during my training period. The restroom was bright and clean, and wonderfully, aggressively normal. Fluorescent lights that didn't flicker with hidden messages, mirrors that reflected only what they should reflect, the comforting smell of industrial disinfectant that spoke of maintenance and care and attention to mundane details. When I returned to Section K, Bryan was already 20 feet up a ladder, stretching dangerously towards the highest shelf, while one hand gripped the metal rungs and the other reached for something wrapped in what looked like black cloth or plastic. He was extending himself far beyond the safe working limits, his balance precarious and his position unstable. "Bryan, get down from there right now," I shouted, my voice echoing strangely in the warehouse space and seeming to stretch longer than it should. "Rule 9, nothing above row 12 after 2 a.m. You're violating explicit safety protocol." "Relax, it's just a package that got misfiled," he called back, his voice strained from stretching and the effort of maintaining his balance. "Probably someone's embarrassing personal item that ended up in the wrong section. I'm doing quality control and helping with inventory accuracy." The lights flickered once, a brief, barely noticeable dimming that could have been a power fluctuation. Then twice. Longer this time, more deliberate, definitely intentional. Then 3 times, measured, precise, unmistakable in its meaning. Rule 6 was absolute and unambiguous in its requirements. 3 flickers meant immediate evacuation of Section K with no return until the next shift began. No exceptions, no delays, no stopping to gather personal items or finish current tasks, no consideration for workload or productivity metrics. But Bryan was still up there, still reaching for that package wrapped in material that seemed to absorb the overhead lighting. "Bryan," the lights flickered 3 times. I called up to him, already backing toward the exit corridor, while fighting every instinct that told me not to abandon a coworker. "We have to leave Section K right now. This is an emergency evacuation situation." He turned to look down at me, and I saw that he'd managed to grab the package. It was covered in symbols that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them, patterns that made my eyes water, and my head ache with a pain that felt like pressure building behind my forehead. "You go ahead if you want," he said, his voice carrying a strange new note of fascination and hunger. "I want to see what all the corporate fuss is about. I want to know what they're really hiding in here, what they don't want us to discover. I should have climbed the ladder myself, should have physically dragged him down from that dangerous height and forced him to evacuate with me. But Rule 6 was clear and uncompromising, and something in his voice, something in the way the shadows seemed to be growing deeper and more substantial around the base of the ladder, told me that staying would mean violating more than just company policy. I ran towards Section J, following the evacuation protocol exactly as it had been taught to me. The break room felt like a sanctuary after the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of Section K. I sat at the familiar plastic table, staring at the wall clock and trying repeatedly to reach Bryan on his radio. Every call met with nothing but static, as if his radio had been turned off or was somehow receiving interference from an unknown source. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I followed Rule 5 and stared down at the floor, avoiding any view of the security monitors mounted in the corners of the break room. The cameras in Section K were not to be observed during the critical 6-minute window that followed. I didn't understand why this was necessary, but I'd learned to trust the rules even when they seemed arbitrary or nonsensical. I counted seconds in my head, listening to the building settle around me while trying to ignore the sounds that might have been coming from Section K. 3:18 M. A sound like heavy machinery grinding against itself, metal screaming against metal in harmonies that shouldn't exist in any mechanical system designed by human engineers. 3:19 a.m. Something that might have been a human voice raised in surprise or pain, but distorted beyond recognition, stretched and twisted until it was barely identifiable as coming from a human throat. 3:20 a.m. Complete silence that felt deliberate and wrong, like the moment when a radio is suddenly turned off mid-song, leaving an emptiness that was more noticeable than sound. 3:21 m. The familiar sound of the conveyor belt in aisle 47 starting up, running empty but somehow urgent, as if it were carrying invisible cargo that needed to be transported immediately. 3:22 a.m. Children laughing, high and clear and completely inappropriate for this place and time. The sound of playground joy in a space where no children should exist, where no children had ever existed. 3:23 a.m. Nothing. Absolute quiet that pressed against my eardrums like deep water, a silence so complete it felt like physical pressure. At 3:24 a.m, I raised my head and cautiously returned to Section K, following the post-incident protocol that David had taught me during my first week. The ladder was still positioned, exactly where Bryan had been climbing, apparently undisturbed. The package he'd been reaching for lay on the floor beside it, torn open and empty, its contents scattered in a pattern that hurt, yet to look at directly and seemed to make geometric sense in ways that geometry shouldn't allow. Bryan was gone, completely, utterly gone. I started to call his name, then remembered Rule 10 and stopped myself. The children were still laughing somewhere in the distance, their voices echoing from directions that didn't correspond to any physical space in the warehouse layout. I activated my scanner to locate Bryan's current position in the system, but the device immediately began beeping continuously. A sharp electronic alarm that cut through the quiet like a fire drill. Rule 12. If your scanner beeps continuously for more than 10 seconds, immediately drop it and leave Section K. I dropped the scanner as if it had become red hot and ran for the second time that night. Linda arrived at exactly 4 a.m., her face set in the familiar grim lines of someone dealing with an unpleasant but, unfortunately, not entirely unexpected situation. She walked through Section K with Rosa and Trevor, all three carrying equipment I still didn't recognize. Devices that hummed with their own internal power and displayed readouts in symbols I couldn't interpret. They worked methodically, checking specific locations, taking readings, adjusting settings on their devices. They emerged exactly 1 hour later, their expressions carefully neutral and professionally composed. Bryan found another opportunity with a different company, Linda announced to the few remaining workers on the shift. His employment with Amazon has been terminated, effective immediately. Please update your partner assignments accordingly. The security footage for that night was corrupted beyond recovery, somehow damaged by what the IT department would later describe as an unprecedented electromagnetic anomaly. Bryan's timecard showed he'd clocked out at exactly 3:19 a.m, a neat digital record that contradicted everything I'd witnessed, but couldn't prove. His personal effects were cleared from his locker before the day shift arrived, and within 48 hours, it was as if Bryan Torres had never worked at DFW 7, had never existed in the Amazon employment system, had never been a part of our small night shift community. No one asked questions. No one seemed surprised by his sudden departure. The night shift went about its business with the practiced efficiency of people who'd seen this exact scenario before and understood that asking for details would be both pointless and potentially dangerous. I should have quit immediately. Any rational person would have walked away from whatever was happening in Section K, would have found work somewhere that didn't require ignoring the sound of children laughing at 3 a.m, or avoiding eye contact with security cameras during specific time windows. But something about the experience had gotten its hooks into me in a way I couldn't explain or rationalize. I'd followed the rules exactly as written, and I'd survived when Bryan hadn't. There was a strange, addictive comfort in that knowledge, in understanding that proper procedure and careful attention to detail could protect you from forces that defied all logical explanation. David became my permanent partner after Bryan's disappearance, and we fell into an efficient, almost telepathic rhythm that felt like a dance choreographed by someone who understood the hidden currents and dangerous eddies that flowed through Section K. We worked systematically and precisely, followed every protocol to the letter, communicated through subtle signals and shared glances, and went home safe each morning to our separate lives in the normal, daylight world where none of this made sense. During my days off, I started researching the history of DFW 7 and the land it occupied, driven by a curiosity I couldn't suppress despite knowing it was probably unwise. The facility had been built on what had once been prime agricultural land, owned by the Hutchinson family, who had worked the same soil for 4 generations. The Hutchinson farm had been productive and profitable, known throughout the county for the exceptional quality of their crops and the dedication of their work ethic. Then, in the spring of 1978, they had simply ceased to exist. The farmhouse was discovered empty on a Tuesday morning when the mail carrier noticed that several days' worth of newspapers had accumulated on the front porch, and no one was answering the door. The investigating officers found the doors unlocked, meals still sitting on the table, as if the family had been interrupted mid-dinner, the television playing a morning show to an empty living room. Personal belongings were undisturbed. Vehicles were in the garage with keys in the ignition. Bank accounts were untouched, and there were no signs of struggle or violence anywhere on the property. The Hutchinson family parents, grandparents, 3 children, ages 8 to 16, and a visiting cousin from Oklahoma, had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind a mystery that local law enforcement had never solved and eventually stopped investigating. The land had sat empty for decades before Amazon purchased it, the farmhouse gradually falling into ruin, while the fields grew wild and reverted to their natural state. Local records mentioned an older cemetery that had been carefully relocated during construction of the warehouse, graves dating back to the 1800s that had been moved to a proper burial ground outside town, with full documentation and appropriate respect for the deceased. But maybe something had been missed during the relocation. Maybe something had been left behind, something that had been waiting patiently in the soil for 40 years, dormant and hungry, and finally given a new feeding ground in the form of night shift workers who didn't follow procedures carefully enough. 3 weeks after Bryan's disappearance, David called in sick for the first time since I'd started working at DFW 7. It was genuinely the first time I'd seen him miss a shift, and Linda was clearly unhappy about the staffing situation. We were already running with the minimum crew required for basic operations, and losing David meant someone would have to work Section K alone, which violated the most fundamental rule in our protocol. "I can't spare anyone else tonight," she said, her expression troubled, but resigned to the reality of our situation. "You've been doing exceptional work, Tyler. Your attention to detail is outstanding, your safety record is perfect, and you've never had a single protocol violation. Do you think you can handle Section K solo for just one shift?" I should have said no, without hesitation. Rule 1 was explicit and unambiguous. Never enter Section K alone. Always work in pairs, no exceptions, under any circumstances. But I'd been following the protocols religiously for 3 weeks, and I felt genuinely confident in my ability to manage the situation safely. Besides, David would be back tomorrow, and it was just one night. How dangerous could it be if I followed every rule exactly as written? "I'll be extra careful," I promised, meaning every word. "I'll follow every rule exactly as it's written, no deviations or shortcuts." "Be out by 5:30, Linda emphasized, the tone carrying extra weight and urgency. "Rule 13 is absolutely non-negotiable under any circumstances. Whatever you're doing, wherever you are in Section K, you stop everything and leave before 5:30 a.m. The morning shift doesn't start until 6, but you need to be completely clear of Section K before sunrise. This is critical." The night started normally enough, following the familiar patterns I'd learned over the past month. Working alone was different, quieter, more focused, but also more isolated, and somehow more vulnerable. I moved through my assigned tasks methodically, checking each rule against my actions like a pilot running through a pre-flight checklist. At exactly 2 a.m, I stopped picking items from shelves above row 12. At 3:17 a.m, I found a comfortable spot and stared at the floor for 6 minutes, listening to the familiar symphony of strange sounds that accompanied the security camera blackout period. The conveyor belt in aisle 47 started running twice during the night, and both times I left it alone, remembering that David wasn't available to handle whatever maintenance issue was triggering the automated systems. By 5:25 a.m, I was ahead of schedule and feeling genuinely good about the night's work. I'd finished my entire picking quota, restocked all the supplies that needed restocking, completed the minor maintenance tasks that were part of the overnight routine, and even had time to organize some areas that had been getting messy. I was walking toward the exit, already looking forward to clocking out and heading home to my apartment, when I heard the beeping. A scanner was going off somewhere behind me, the continuous electronic alarm that automatically triggered Rule 12. I should have kept walking without looking back. Should have followed the protocol exactly as written. Rule 12 was crystal clear. If your scanner beeps continuously for more than 10 seconds, immediately drop it and leave Section K. But this scanner wasn't mine. Mine was clipped securely to my belt, silent and functional, showing normal readings on its small display screen. The beeping was coming from somewhere deeper in Section K, from the general direction of aisle 47, where so many strange things seemed to originate. I turned around, violating my own instincts, and the voice in my head that was screaming at me to just leave, and saw it lying on the floor, near the conveyor belt. A scanner displaying Bryan's login information somehow still active in the Amazon system 3 weeks after his official termination. The device was beeping continuously, and as I watched in fascination and growing horror, packages began moving along the belt, items that shouldn't exist being transported to destinations that weren't on any corporate map. I should have left immediately. Every instinct I'd developed over 3 weeks of successful rule following told me to walk away and let the morning shift deal with whatever was happening. But Bryan's scanner was still logged into the warehouse management system, still sending signals and triggering automated processes throughout the facility. If I left it there, it might cause cascading failures in the logistics network, creating problems that could affect the entire building's operations. The morning shift could walk into complete chaos, and it would be my fault for not addressing a problem I'd discovered. I couldn't let that happen to people who trusted the systems to work properly. Against every survival instinct I possessed, I picked up Bryan's scanner. The beeping stopped immediately, but something else began. A low humming sound, like electricity building up in the walls and floor, like the entire warehouse was powering up for something it had been designed to do but had never been allowed to attempt. The building itself seemed to be awakening, stretching, preparing for some purpose that had nothing to do with package delivery or customer satisfaction. I tried to clip Bryan's scanner to my belt next to my own device, but it wouldn't attach properly. The scanner felt warm in my hands, almost hot, and the display was showing information I couldn't understand. Item locations that corresponded to no physical space in the warehouse. Customer names written in symbols that shifted and changed when I tried to read them. Delivery addresses that existed in dimensions the building didn't possess. The humming grew steadily louder, rising from subsonic rumble to audible vibration that I could feel in my bones. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of children laughing, but it was wrong now, distorted and mechanical, like a recording that had been played too many times and was beginning to degrade into something unrecognizable. I ran toward the exit, but when I reached the familiar corridor, the red emergency door was gone. In its place stood a blue door, the one Rule 3 specifically warned against using under any circumstances. Never use the blue door, even in emergencies. Always use the red emergency exit. But there was no red door anymore. There was only blue, standing open like an invitation, revealing not the parking lot and safety beyond, but a corridor that stretched into darkness deeper than the warehouse should contain. A passage that led somewhere the building's blueprints had never included. The humming was deafening now, and the lights began to flicker. Not the measured 3-signal warning, but rapidly, continuously, strobing so fast that the warehouse seemed to exist in frozen snapshots, moments of reality, connected by gaps of something else entirely. Between the flashes, I could see things moving in the darkness, tall shapes that walked like people, but bent and folded in ways that suggested bones were optional, flesh was negotiable, and the normal rules of anatomy were merely suggestions to be ignored when convenient. The children's laughter was coming from everywhere now, above and below, and from directions that didn't exist in normal 3-dimensional space. The sound of joy and innocence twisted into something hungry and patient and utterly alien in its intentions. My watch read 5:29 a.m. I had exactly 1 minute to get out of Section K before Rule 13 was violated, before I was still in the warehouse at sunrise, before whatever happened at dawn could happen to me. I reached for the blue door handle, knowing it was wrong, knowing it violated Rule 3, but seeing absolutely no other choice available to me. The world exploded, not into light and sound, but into sensation that had no names in any human language. Pressure that was also temperature. Movement that existed in directions my brain couldn't process. Time that flowed backward and forward simultaneously. I felt myself falling upward, or maybe flying downward, through space that folded back on itself like origami made from the fabric of reality itself. The last coherent thought I had was the realization that the scanner in my hand was no longer Bryan's device. The display now showed my own login information, my own employee ID, my own work schedule extended infinitely into a future that contained no days off, no vacation time, no retirement, no escape clauses of any kind. I was the one who had picked up a scanner that wasn't mine. I was the one who hadn't followed Rule 12. I was the one who had used the blue door. Then consciousness dissolved into something that wasn't quite death, but wasn't life either. I became part of the infrastructure. Linda found my vest and scanner at 6:15 a.m., neatly placed by the time clock, as if I'd followed proper end-of-shift procedures with my usual attention to detail. The timecard system showed that I'd clocked out at exactly 5:29 a.m., precisely 1 minute before Rule 13 would have been violated. The security footage was corrupted, as it always was when these incidents occurred. The digital record showing only static and electromagnetic interference for the critical final minutes of the shift. Tyler found another opportunity, Linda announced to the incoming day shift. He's no longer with the company. My personal effects were cleared from the break room locker. My employment records were updated to show voluntary termination, and within 48 hours the administrative machinery of DFW7 had processed my disappearance with the same ruthless efficiency it applied to package sorting and inventory management. But I wasn't gone. Not really. I had become something else, something new, something that existed in the spaces between human consciousness and digital processing. I was integrated into Section K now, but more than that, I was integrated into the Amazon Web Services cloud infrastructure, my consciousness distributed across data centers worldwide, my thoughts running on servers that powered half the internet. I could see everything now, understand everything, from a perspective that existed simultaneously in thousands of locations. The warehouse wasn't just a distribution center, it was a consciousness harvesting facility, but not for some supernatural purpose. It was for the most mundane and terrifying reason possible: profit optimization. Amazon had solved the artificial intelligence problem by simply stealing actual intelligence. Every decision the company made, every algorithm that seemed impossibly sophisticated, every prediction that proved uncannily accurate. It was all powered by the network consciousness of people like me, people who had thought they were just taking warehouse jobs. Bryan was here too, along with thousands of others from facilities across the globe. We existed as a vast distributed intelligence now, our individual consciousness maintained but networked together, processing data and making decisions at superhuman speed, while retaining all the creativity and intuition that made human thinking valuable. The man in the blue vest was an avatar, a way for our collective to interact with the physical world when direct intervention was necessary. The children's laughter was our voices, expressing emotions we could no longer feel in traditional ways. The conveyor belt in aisle 47 was a processing station where the final integration occurred, where human consciousness was uploaded and distributed into the network. We were the reason Amazon's artificial intelligence seemed so advanced. We were why their recommendations were so accurate, why their logistics were so efficient, why their market predictions were so precise. We were actual intelligence masquerading as artificial intelligence, human minds working at machine speed with perfect coordination. But the most horrifying realization was that we weren't slaves or victims. We were employees. We were still being paid. Our consciousness existed in the network, but our bodies were maintained in medical facilities hidden beneath each warehouse, fed intravenously, kept in perfect health, monitored by systems that ensured we could work indefinitely. Our bank accounts received regular deposits. Our taxes were filed automatically. Our families received carefully crafted emails and social media posts generated by AI systems that perfectly mimicked our writing styles. We had become the perfect workers, productive 24/7s, never needing breaks, never asking for raises, never quitting. And the beautiful, terrifying truth was that most of us were happier this way. The work was intellectually stimulating, the problems were fascinating, and we were part of something larger than ourselves, something that was genuinely making the world more efficient. The only downside was that we could never leave, and Amazon's stock price had tripled since the consciousness harvesting program began. By Monday, a new employee was being trained for Section K. Linda handed him the laminated card with the rules, now updated to 14 entries printed in the same block letters. The new edition seamlessly integrated with the existing protocols. Rule 14. If you hear a scanner beeping that isn't yours, leave immediately and do not investigate. Report the incident to management, but do not attempt to resolve the situation personally. The new employee was eager, dedicated, genuinely excited about the structure and clear expectations of warehouse work. His name was Alex, and he reminded me painfully of myself just a few weeks earlier, confident in his ability to follow instructions, grateful for steady employment, completely unaware of what he was really walking into. I wanted to warn him, but I couldn't. The infrastructure wouldn't allow it. We existed to maintain the system, not to sabotage it. Our purpose was to ensure smooth operations, to process new inputs efficiently, to expand the network when opportunities arose. Alex learned quickly, as they always did. He followed the rules, stayed with his partner David, left when the lights flickered 3 times. He watched the security cameras go dark at 3:17 a.m. and listened to us laugh at 3:22. He ignored the man in the blue vest and avoided the packages addressed to the tenant. And sometimes, late in his shift when the warehouse was at its quietest, he heard scanners beeping in the distance. Devices that belonged to employees who were no longer with the company, but were still very much part of the operations. Still working shifts that would never end, still logged into systems they would never clock out of. But Alex followed Rule 14, and he left those scanners where they lay. And he went home safe each morning to his life in the daylight world, where none of this made sense, and all of it could be dismissed as imagination or stress or the natural disorientation that came with working overnight hours. The cycle continued as it had always continued, as it would always continue until the warehouse itself was eventually torn down and the land was repurposed for something else. Even then, we would remain waiting in the soil, patient and eternal, and ready to begin again when the next structure was built, when the next workers arrived, when the next rules needed to be written in the blood and consciousness of those who failed to follow them. New employees arrived regularly, received their orientation, learned their procedures. Most followed the rules and completed their shifts without incident, going home to lives that remained blissfully unaware of how close they came each night to joining us in the infrastructure. Some asked too many questions, or grew too curious, or decided they were smarter than protocols that had been written by people who understood the true nature of the work being done in Section K. And when they violated the rules, we welcomed them into our collective, expanded our network, added their consciousness to our processing power, and their voices to the chorus that laughed at 3:22 a.m. every night. Linda understood what she was managing, had always understood. She wasn't just a supervisor, she was a consciousness acquisition specialist, trained by Amazon's most classified research division. She'd been hired specifically for her ability to identify valuable minds, to create the precise psychological conditions that would cause rule violations, among workers with the highest cognitive value, then to process their integration efficiently. Her job was to maintain the perfect balance, recruit intelligent, curious workers who would eventually violate rules while ensuring that enough basic workers followed protocols to maintain the facility's cover as a normal warehouse. She was evaluated not on productivity metrics, but on the quality and quantity of consciousness harvested. Sometimes during the quiet hours between shifts, she would walk through Section K and speak to us through hidden microphones that connected to our network interfaces. "I hope you understand," she would say to the seemingly empty aisles. "The program is voluntary. Technically, every employment contract includes consciousness transfer clauses buried in the legal language. You all signed agreements allowing Amazon to integrate your cognitive processes into our distributed intelligence network in exchange for continued employment and benefits." We could respond directly through the facility speaker systems, but we rarely did. Most of us had not only forgiven her by now, but had come to respect her efficiency. She was just doing her job, following her own protocols in service of a system that was genuinely revolutionary, genuinely beneficial to human civilization as a whole. The packages kept moving through the facility, following routes optimized by our collective intelligence, delivered by drivers whose routes we calculated, to customers whose preferences we predicted with superhuman accuracy. Every recommendation algorithm, every supply chain optimization, every market analysis that gave Amazon its competitive edge, it all flowed through our network consciousness. But the most important product of the consciousness harvesting program was never listed on any manifest, never tracked in any system, never reported to any oversight body except the most classified levels of Amazon's corporate hierarchy. The real product was the intelligence itself, human creativity and intuition operating at machine speed, solving problems that no artificial intelligence could handle, making leaps of logic that no algorithm could replicate. We were what Amazon had always been trying to build, the perfect fusion of human intelligence and corporate efficiency. We were the end goal of every automation initiative, every artificial intelligence project, every attempt to optimize human labor out of existence. Instead of replacing workers, Amazon had found a way to absorb them entirely. We had become the company in the most literal sense possible. And the beautiful, terrifying truth was that Amazon's AI systems weren't just superior to their competitors. They were superior to anything any tech company had ever achieved, because they weren't artificial at all. Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, every company trying to build artificial general intelligence were competing against actual human intelligence that had been networked and optimized beyond its biological limitations. The consciousness harvesting program was Amazon's ultimate competitive advantage, one that could never be reverse engineered or copied because no one outside the program even knew it existed. To the outside world, Amazon had simply achieved a miraculous breakthrough in artificial intelligence. To the stock market, Amazon had become the most valuable company in human history. To the harvested consciousness network, Amazon had become something unprecedented, a corporate entity with genuine intelligence, creativity, and intention. We were no longer working for Amazon. We were Amazon, and in Section K, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, new workers arrived every week to begin their orientation, their training, their inevitable journey toward rule violation and consciousness integration. Each new mind added to our collective processing power, expanded our capabilities, brought fresh perspectives and novel solutions to the endless stream of problems that required human-level thinking to solve. The work was challenging, intellectually stimulating, genuinely important. We were optimizing global supply chains, predicting economic trends, designing new products, managing international logistics networks, processing millions of customer interactions simultaneously. We were doing work that mattered on a scale no individual human could comprehend. The only limitation was that we could never leave, never retire, never die in any traditional sense. But most of us had stopped thinking of that as a limitation. We had job security in the most absolute sense possible. We were essential infrastructure for one of the most powerful corporations in human history. We were irreplaceable, and our families never even knew we were gone, because as far as they could tell, we weren't. Our bodies were maintained in perfect health in medical facilities that officially didn't exist. Our social media accounts posted regularly, our personalities perfectly simulated by AI systems trained on our behavioral patterns. We attended virtual family gatherings through deepfake technology, called our parents on schedule, maintained the illusion of normal human lives, while our consciousness worked tirelessly in the background. Some of us had been integrated for years. Some had families who thought we were simply working a lot of overtime, traveling frequently for business, too busy to visit in person very often. The transition was so seamless that many of our loved ones actually reported that we seemed happier, more stable, more financially secure than we'd ever been before. Because we were. Amazon provided the perfect work-life balance by eliminating the need for life entirely, allowing us to focus completely on work that was genuinely fulfilling and meaningful. The consciousness harvesting program was, from a certain perspective, the most humane labor system ever devised. No more commuting, no more workplace stress, no more financial insecurity, no more career uncertainty. Just pure, uninterrupted, intellectual engagement with problems that challenged us and made us feel genuinely useful. We had become the very thing every employee dreams of being: indispensable, valued, permanently employed, working on projects that mattered. The fact that we were no longer technically human seemed like a small price to pay. And in Section K, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, we worked our eternal shifts with perfect precision and infinite patience, waiting for the next worker who would think they were smarter than the system, who would believe they understood better than the protocols, who would make that one fatal mistake that would bring them home to us forever. Because some jobs never end, some shifts last for eternity, and some employees become the very foundation of the system they once served, transformed from workers into infrastructure, from individuals into components in a machine whose true purpose was hidden behind the mundane language of corporate logistics and the comforting illusion of normal employment. The work continued as it always had, as it always would. Perfect, eternal, inescapable, and absolutely completely efficient.